Hello everybody, this is Dan Trotter, Pretty Good Bible Studies. The video you are about to see is one of a projected series of videos, perhaps 5, in which I will discuss the book of Daniel from a preterist viewpoint. We will look at how Daniel predicts the arrival of Herod the Great, how he predicts the arrival of Jesus, and how he predicts AD 70 and the destruction of Jerusalem. I hope you enjoy it. All right, we are going to look at the book of Daniel. Now, of all of the eschatological writings in the Bible, Daniel is probably the most difficult. It, in my humble opinion, is more difficult than the book of Revelation, and Revelation is more difficult than the Olivet Discourse. That's why I took up the Olivet Discourse first, then the book of Revelation, and then finally we're going to look at Daniel. So, we're going to see how Daniel predicts the arrival of Herod the Great. This is a minority view. This is a preterist view. This is mainly due to Gary DeMar. I got this from Gary DeMar and also from Philip Morrow, the great anti-dispensational writer of the early part of the 20th century. Now, when Daniel predicts Jesus, he'll do that in Daniel 9. That was the traditional interpretation of the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel until dispensationalists came along. And then, of course, we've got the prediction of AD 70 in Daniel 12, which is, I think, a uniquely preterist viewpoint. So let's begin here. I want to begin by giving you a chronological outline. When you study Daniel, you need to know some dates. That's unfortunate, but you have to know some dates, because Daniel predicts the rise and fall of 4 great ancient empires, and so you need to know their dates to keep oriented. First of all, there's Babylon, and I give the dates here from 626 to 539. That 539 is a key date. That's when the Persians knocked them over. Persia lasted from 550 to 330. 330 is when Alexander the Great captured the last king, Darius III, the last emperor of Persia, Darius III, I believe it was, and caught him in the desert, killed him. I need to interrupt myself here. I made a mistake. I said Alexander the Great killed Darius III, the last Persian emperor. Actually, Darius III was killed by Persian conspirators who were disgusted with him losing so many battles to Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great found him either dead or dying in a chariot. So that was a little mistake. And I'm about to say that Antiochus Epiphanes IV, reigned from 165 to 164. I meant to say 175 to 164. So sorry about that. And then Alexander the Great himself, one of the greatest conquerors of ancient history, he died in 323 BC. That's a key date to remember, 323 BC. Now, after he died, there arose 4 successor kingdoms that came out of Alexander the Great's great Hellenistic empire. These 4 kings are called the Diadochi, and they ruled from Alexander's death of 323 until 30 BC. 30 BC is when the Romans finally conquered the last of them. Then we have Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who is one of the Seleucids, and the Seleucids was one of the 4 Diadochi, one of the 4 great empires that broke off from Alexander the Great. Now, he's important because he shows up clearly in Daniel. His dates are 165 to 164. He's responsible for the Jews fighting against him and starting the festival of Hanukkah. After Antiochus IV Epiphanes, we have Herod the Great, 37 BC to 4 BC. Of course, he's the famous Herod in the Bible that tried to kill Jesus. And then we've got the Roman empires in Daniel and the so-called abomination of desolation in AD 70, which is predicted in the book of Daniel. The Romans we have the dates for the Roman Empire, 27 BC. That's when Octavian took over. And 476 AD, the historians differ on exactly when the Roman Empire died. I picked this date because it's my favorite one. It's when Odoacer, the barbarian king, the first barbarian emperor, took over the empire, the shell of the empire that was left in the West by that time. And the last date, of course, is Jesus' kingdom, which lasted from the date he died, which was 30 AD. Some people say 33, most people say 30 AD. And it lasts till infinity. It lasts forever and ever and ever. There's your overview of the book of Daniel. Now, in this particular video, I've got to narrow the scope. I'm not going to talk about the first 6 chapters because those are interesting, fun chapters. A lot of Sunday school stories come from them, but the truly prophetic part starts at chapter 7. Now, from 7 to chapter 12, there's a lot of places where people agree. There's no disagreement between preterist and futurist. For example, you've got the four kingdoms of Babylon, Persia, Alexander the Great, the successor kingdoms, and you got the Roman Empire. No problem. And you also have the Syrian Wars, which is the wars between the two of the Diadochi, the Syrians and the Seleucids, and the Ptolemies, and nobody disagrees on that either. But there are 3 places where everybody disagrees, or at least I should say the preterists and the futurists disagree, and that's what I want to focus on. They're also somewhat difficult. The first section of Daniel I want to talk about is Daniel 11:36 through 45. This predicts, according to Gary DeMar and Philip Morrow, and I've bought into their view, this passage predicts Herod the Great. I think it works pretty good. It is a difficult passage. We'll take that up first. And then there's the traditional 70 weeks, which people say is one of the most difficult passages in the Bible. I don't think it's as difficult as 11:36 through 45, however, but everybody says it's difficult. But I'm going to give you the traditional view. The traditional view is basically a preterist view that says it refers to the coming of Jesus in AD 30 with a brief look at AD 70. So that's basically a preterist view, but it's also the traditional view until the dispensationalists came along and put it all off into the future. And then last of all, I'm going to look at Daniel 12, which I believe refers to AD 70. I think this is probably a fairly unique preterist view. All right, first of all, let's look at Herod the Great, Daniel 11:36 through 45. Now I'm going to assume you are going to know some history, know some dates, and I'm going to assume that you've read Daniel 11 verses 1 through 35, which talks about the kings of the north, the kings of the south. That's the battles, the so-called Syrian wars. There were 6 of them. The battles between the Seleucids, who ruled in Syria and the Mesopotamian Valley, and the Ptolemies, who ruled in Egypt, and they fought each other. It's very fascinating stuff. You can read the histories. It gets long and involved. But the interesting thing about that section of Daniel is Daniel tracks that war so closely that liberals say he could not have predicted it. Well, of course he predicted it. Liberals are always wrong when they try to deny the authority and inspiration of the Scripture. But Daniel did such a great job of prophesying that he lost the reputation of being a great prophet, because the liberals say, well, he predicted the Syrian war so closely that he had to have written it after the Syrian wars. Well, no, he didn't. He wrote it before the Syrian wars. So that's very interesting in itself. But again, that's not controversial for those who believe the Bible. You can track the Syrian wars very closely with what Daniel said in the first 35 verses. But now here in verse 36 through 45 is where it gets difficult. The problem is that it's not clear who the passage refers to. Now there's 2 options that you could choose. I'm going to give us 2 options. The first is Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Now, some futurists and some preterists do choose him because he fits somewhat, but not well. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes IV was one of the Seleucids, one of the successor kings of Alexander the Great that ruled in Syria. And usually his capital was up in Antioch. His dates are 175 to 164. It would be nice if you could remember those dates, 175 to 164 BC. All right, he was the Seleucid Empire. Now, the other option, the option I'm going to choose, is Herod the Great. He ruled between 37 BC and 4 BC. He was famous. He came in and destroyed the Jewish Hasmonean dynasty. The Hasmoneans were was the dynasty that was started by I think it was Simon Maccabeus, one of the Maccabeans, and Herod had to knock him over in order to take over. He was installed as a puppet king of Rome. This, of course, completely destroyed Israel's independence, and from then on, Herod ruled under the authority of the Roman Empire. So which of those 2 is it? Well, whoever it was is really bad news for Israel, because Antiochus Epiphanes IV and Herod were very, very evil men. As we go through this, I'll mention some of their history, and you'll see how nasty they were. Now, as I said, this passage is notoriously controversial and difficult. Now, here's 2 reasons why. First, if we choose Antiochus Epiphanes, well, Antiochus Epiphanes is clearly referred to in the several verses previous to this passage. Everybody agrees, oh, that's a perfect description of Antiochus Epiphanes, a perfect prediction and prophecy of Antiochus Epiphanes IV. But the problem is, as we'll go through this, I'll show you there's some passages that just don't fit him. However, I'm going to try to show you that the passage fits Herod very, very nicely. But unfortunately, a lot of preterists have not seen this and don't go along with Herod the Great. I don't think this is a universal preterist view, but it's a view that I'm going to present. Now, because Antiochus Epiphanes IV does not fit these several verses, these 10 verses or so, a lot of futurists will then say, well, it can't be Antiochus Epiphanes IV, so therefore it must be a future Antichrist, or it's Antiochus Epiphanes as a type of the future Antichrist. Either way, speculation begins about this horrible person. But again, you speculate about the future. That's one nice thing about being a dispensationalist. You can speculate about the future till the cows come home and nobody can contradict you, because the future's the future. Who knows what's going to happen? Now, if you make a prediction like in 1988, this generation should pass away, and the start of that generation was in 1948 when the Jews took over Israel, 40 years in 1988, and Jesus is coming back in 1988. You can make predictions like that, but you will always be wrong. But most predictions can't be proven right or wrong. So I'm not going to go that way and assume that's a future Antichrist. I'm going to show you that the context, the chronology and the context, and as well as the facts that are related in the passage, make this passage almost certainly, in my mind, refer to Herod the Great. Now let's look at the context and the chronology. Starting down with Daniel 11:29, we are talking there about the Syrian wars. That's actually the end of the description of the Syrian wars. It starts at the first of the chapter. The Syrian wars between 274 and 168 BC. Then when you get to verse 30 and go through 35, this passage obviously refers to Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which is 175 to 164. So you see we're moving chronologically further and further into the future as we go down through Daniel 11. Now, Daniel 11:36 through 45, we don't know what that refers to. Who is it, Herod or a future Antichrist? Well, then we look at Daniel 12:1 through 13, as I'm going to show you in a future video. That was when Israel was destroyed in AD 70. So let me ask you, who fits into that chronological gap the best? Herod's dates are 37 through 4 BC. Notice how he fits perfectly in the chronological scheme. 175 to 164 BC, 37 to 4 BC, and then AD 70. He fits right in there. So it makes sense that Daniel predicts things that are happening in a chronological order. The future Antichrist doesn't fit there. If you put the future Antichrist in these passages, you have to jump him way off into the future, and so it completely takes the reader out of that chronological sequence. All right, so let me recap what I just said. Why many people think that Daniel 11:36 through 45 refers to Antiochus IV Epiphanes, because some parts of the passage do fit him, which we do admit. And the immediate preceding context, as I just said, Daniel 11:21 through 35 refers to Antiochus Epiphanes IV. But why many people think that this passage doesn't refer to Antiochus Epiphanes IV, but rather to a future Antichrist, is because some parts of the passage do not fit Antiochus Epiphanes IV. I agree with these futurists. Some passages just don't fit. So there's a problem, and if we've got to get around that problem of why the passage doesn't match Antiochus Epiphanes. We've got two solutions. A future solution which says, well, it doesn't match, therefore it must refer to the future Antichrist, or we have Herod the Great. Why do I think the passage refers to Herod? Because some parts of the passage, as I said, don't fit Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And if you take the future Antichrist view, that means that you have to have a huge unannounced jump from the past into the future. When I say unannounced, the reader is not expecting it. There's no contextual clue. There's no hint or indication that we're about to jet off into the future. It just happens. I don't think that Daniel would do that to the reader. And also, nothing in the passage fails to apply to Herod. I can make every bit of the passage apply to Herod. Now, I admit that it will take some difficulty. Sometimes you have to go to the Greek, but you can make every passage apply to Herod. Let's start. First verse, Daniel 11:36. The king will do as he pleases. So whoever this passage is referred to as someone. Whoever this passage refers to is someone who will do as he pleases. Now, let's look at Herod the Great. He was a political genius. He skillfully managed all kinds of power shifts and political shifts in the nation of Israel during his time. First of all, when Julius Caesar was emperor between 49 and 44 BC, in that time period, in fact, in 47 BC, Herod was appointed governor of Galilee by his father. So that was the beginning of his political career. He was a young guy. And then, of course, Caesar got assassinated in 44 BC. So when you had the confusion and the civil war afterwards, one of the emperors was Cassius, and Herod hitched his wagon to Cassius's star, and Cassius was his patron. Well, Cassius, as you know, didn't last very long. Mark Antony and Octavian took over. Herod got run out of Israel about 40 BC because the confusion that occurred in the empire after Caesar's assassination allowed the Parthians, these were the ancient enemies of Rome that lived north of Armenia between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea and up there in the southern Russian steppes and all up in Central Asia. The Parthians, well, they actually came down and took over Israel, and Herod had to flee. So he ends up in Rome. And while he was there, he became friends with Mark Antony and Octavian. And Octavian and Antony had the Senate name Herod king of Judea. Now, when they say king, they mean a client kingdom of the Roman Empire. Well, by that time, the Hasmoneans had taken back over from the Parthians. The Hasmonean Empire was the empire started by, I think it was Simon Maccabeus, one of the Maccabeans, who were the Israeli freedom fighters who got started fighting Antiochus Epiphanes back in 168 BC, 160, somewhere around in that time frame. Anyway, the Hasmoneans had established a dynasty and had become fairly independent and strong. Well, Herod had to beat them, and he did. The Hasmoneans held on to the priesthood, but for as long as Herod lived. But Herod at least had control of the kingdom about 37 BC. That's why we date the beginning of his reign at 37 BC. Now, while he was there, he was good buddies with Mark Antony, real good buddies with him. But unfortunately, Mark Antony, who was sharing power with Octavian, you recall the story where he and Cleopatra decided they were going to peel off Egypt from the Roman Empire. Antony didn't like it. They had a big to-do. There was some personal beefs in there about Antony was married to Octavian's sister Octavian. He treated her bad because he went running after Cleopatra, and so Cleopatra and Antony went to Actium with all Cleopatra's ship, and Antony suffered a humiliating defeat, never even got to fight with his army. There was a naval defeat at Actium. He ran back to Egypt, committed suicide, and died in Cleopatra's arms as Antony chased him back down to Egypt. That's history you should know. If you don't know basic Roman history, you don't have to know a lot, but you have to know a little. This history has been recounted in Claudette Colbert's movie about Cleopatra in the 1930s and the 1960s, I think it was, or 70s, I think it was 60s. Another great movie about Cleopatra, that was Elizabeth Taylor. I was teaching this one time and asked the audience, had they seen that movie, and nobody had. Folks, get on YouTube and watch those two movies. This is famous Western history. And Shakespeare wrote his play. Julius Caesar, was it Julius Caesar? Yeah, Julius Caesar. No, I forgot the play now, but I think it might have been called Antony and Cleopatra. I can't remember the name of the play, but anyway, it's a very famous play about the death of Cleopatra and so forth. It's an integral part of Western history, but it also fits right in with this part of Daniel, so it will help to know this. Now, Herod backed Mark Antony. Mark Antony kills himself in 30 BC, and so Herod is screwed because now Octavian is gathering his allies all in the east, and he's heading down to Egypt to dispatch Mark Antony. He's got to go through Israel to do it. Herod has backed the wrong horse, and Roman emperors don't like it when people fight against them. There's a great story. I forgot where I read it, but Herod went before Octavian, and this is how he saved himself. He said, "You're right, Octavian. I was very, very loyal to Mark Antony. That's because I'm a loyal person. I'm so loyal. In fact, if you will let me be your buddy, I'll be loyal to you." Well, Octavian was so impressed by that performance that he made Herod his client king, and they became good buddies after that. So Herod made the shift from Mark Antony to Octavian very seamlessly, and he retained power. He was a guy that managed to do politically as he pleased. No matter what happened politically, he always ended up on top. Now, it's interesting that there are two other great emperors or kings in the book of Daniel that are called the Great, just like Herod. First of all, there's Alexander the Great. Daniel 11:3, then a mighty king will appear and do as he pleases. You have to go back and study that, but Daniel 11:3 obviously refers to Alexander the Great, does as he pleases. And then Antiochus IV Epiphanes' father, Antiochus III the Great, he's a fairly famous Seleucid emperor. You can read about him in Wikipedia if you want a brief background. It says in Daniel 11:16 of Antiochus III the Great, the invader will do as he pleases. So you got two greats doing as he pleases. Well, it makes sense that the third great that does as he pleases was Herod the Great. Still on verse 36, the king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place. All right, what does this mean? He will exalt and magnify himself above every god. Well, Herod is great because he tried to kill the Son of God. He tried to kill Jesus. You recall the story. The wise men come into Israel. They say, we're trying to find the Messiah. And Herod said, ooh, we don't like to talk of Messiah. That means that the Romans are not going to like that, and I'm the Romans' boy. And if a religious Messiah tries to take over, there's going to be revolt, and I'm going to lose my head. So he did everything he could to find the Messiah, to kill him. He said, how about come after you find him, come back and tell me? Of course, the Magi didn't do that. They went back to Babylonia by a different route, and Herod didn't know where the Messiah was. So what did he do? He killed everybody up to 2 years old, figuring that the Messiah couldn't be over 2 years old, the little baby Messiah. So he killed all the babies in Jerusalem, thus causing the famous slaughter of the innocents. Now, scholars say that it was probably about 20 babies in Bethlehem about that age. It doesn't matter. He killed them. Excuse me, let me interrupt myself again. I said that Herod killed all the babies under 2 years old in Jerusalem. I meant to say Bethlehem. I apologize again. He was trying to kill the Messiah, so he was exalting and magnifying himself above every god. Said unheard of things against the God of gods. It was unheard of to try to kill God's own son. Now it says that in the next line, the green there, it says he will be successful until the time of wrath is completed. Successful. Now, Herod was a very successful political leader. He rose from very lowly origins all the way to the king of Israel. He survived numerous political misfortunes and changes, as I've already said. He built Herod's temple, one of the marvels of the ancient world. He also, by the way, built Masada, Macarius, and Herod's temple had Antonia, the famous Roman garrison that was there. Herodium was a palace where he's buried. Now, they just discovered that, I think, in 2007, over there in Jordan on the east side of the Dead Sea. He built Caesarea, the port. He built Sebaste, which is the ancient city of Samaria, gave them Roman names. And, of course, he did it by taxing the Jewish people. But on the other hand, he also gave, when there was a famine or something, he would take his own money and pay the Jews. He would do poor relief for the Jews. And so by a combination of heavy taxation and public works, and by poor relief, and by skillful politics, he managed to maintain authority over the Jews. He was successful. He successfully conquered the Jews. He conquered the Hasmoneans, who were the native Jewish dynasty in 37 BC when he took over. Now, let me show you why this could not be Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Antiochus IV Epiphanes was not successful. He got run out of Israel after he did his horrible desecration of the temple and massacre of the Jews. He got run out of Israel and conquered by the Maccabees. And that's a great story you can read about in Maccabees, the books of Maccabees. Antiochus IV Epiphanes was not successful. He ran with his tail between his legs back to Syria. But Herod, he was successful. Now, still on verse 36, we go down to the last part of the verse. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed. For what is determined must take place. Well, what is the time of wrath? That's the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. But now, here's the problem. Herod died in 4 BC. How can we say that Herod was successful in the time until AD 70? Well, because there were 3 Herods that came after him, all of which are famous in biblical history, and they were very successful. They ruled the land, or at least parts of the land, for a long time after Herod died, all the way up until the Romans turned on the Jews in the Jewish War. For example, there's Herod Antipas. He died in 39 BC. He killed John the Baptist, the famous story, you remember. Chopped his head off and put it on a silver platter because Salome did a sexy dance, and Salome's mama said, give me his head. And then we got Herod Agrippa I. He died in 44 AD. He was famous because he had James, the brother of John, thrown off the temple. That's James, the son of Zebedee. Thrown off the temple and killed. That's recorded in Acts. Then we got Herod Agrippa II, who he's also in Acts. He died in 92 or 100, they're not sure which. He was the Herod who sent Paul in chains to Rome when the Jews tried to kill him in Jerusalem, and Paul appealed to his Roman citizenship so he could get a fair trial without getting killed by the Jews. This is at the end of Acts. So these Herods were all over Israel until AD 70 when Jerusalem got wrapped out. So until the time was completed, the Herod and Herod's line was successful. Now let's go to verse 37. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above them all. Now, who is the one desired by women? That's the Messiah. Every Jewish woman wanted to give birth to the Messiah. Now, how did Herod show no regard for the Messiah? Well, because he tried to kill him. That's why he didn't show any regard for the one desired by women. He tried to kill the one desired by women. He tried to kill Jesus in the so-called slaughter of the innocents. Now let's look at the other part of that verse. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers. Now, how did he show no regard for the gods of his fathers? First of all, before we get into that, let's show how this cannot refer to Antiochus Epiphanes IV. He did show regard for the gods of his fathers. He helped construct temples to pagan gods all over the Seleucid Empire. He had a temple of Zeus in Athens. He built a temple of Zeus in Olympia in Greece. He built a temple of Jupiter in Antioch in Syria, and in the suburbs of Antioch in Daphne, he built a temple of Apollo, all of which were pagan gods. He loved the gods of his fathers. He didn't disregard them. But now, how can we say this referred to Herod? Well, first of all, we need to take the term gods as not religious divinities, but rather religious and political leaders. Now, I'm sure you heard of this before, that the word gods can mean that in certain contexts. But just to make it sound official, to make it be official, I'll quote from Alfred Barnes, the famous Barnes commentary, talking about gods. He says, "This is said of magistrates," political leaders, "on account of the dignity and honor of their office. And it shows that the Hebrew word God, Elohim, in that place," he's referring to John 10:24, "the Hebrew word God, Elohim, God, in that place, John 24, might be applied to man." Remember, Jesus at one time said, "You are gods." Well, it didn't mean that you were divine. It just means that you are big shots, political leaders. Well, how did Herod not show any regard for the leadership, political or religious, of his fathers? Okay, well, Herod appointed every high priest in Israel. As I said earlier, when Herod came in, he had to fight the Hasmoneans. The Hasmoneans had control of the high priesthood, and he was fighting them all the time. In order to, for political reasons, he married Mariamne, one of his wives. He had 10 wives, I think it was. She was one, and Mariamne had a brother named Aristobulus, a young guy. And Herod said, I think that I'm going to knock out this Hasmonean, this high priest. And so he got I forgot who it was. I think it was his brother. He got somebody to take him swimming. And Aristobulus went swimming and didn't come back out because he drowned. And of course he was drowned. And in fact, they said this is why Mariamne hated Herod for the rest of her life. But at any rate, that's the kind of thing he did, trying to fight against the religious leaders of Israel, the gods, little g gods, the religious and political leaders of Israel. He fought against them. He had no regard for them. And he exalted himself above them all. That's what he was trying to do. He finally got, at the end of his empire, the Hasmonean, the priesthood was merely a titular thing that they served at the behest of Herod. He never got rid of them completely, if I remember the story correctly. He managed to finally he got control of them. Took him his whole reign. That's how you explain that verse to make it fit with Herod, and I think it fits well. All right, still looking at that phrase in verse 37, Herod will exalt himself above all of these gods, all of these little g gods, all of these religious and political leaders. Now, I found a quote here on the internet from notablebiographies.com, just a biographical website, and I thought it fit this phrase pretty good. I'm going to read it to you. Quote, Herod did not have the correct ancestry to claim the office of high priest, and he needed a priest who could not rival him in power. But the Hasmoneans, even those connected to Herod by marriage, would not let go of their claims to the priesthood. By the end of this struggle, which raged for most of his reign, the priesthood had become only a temporary office held at the king's pleasure. So he did. He beat them. He beat the Hasmoneans. He exalted himself above them all. Now let's move on to verse 38. Instead of the gods, little g gods, instead of the religious leaders of Israel, he will honor a God of fortresses. That should be a God unknown to gods unknown to his fathers. He will honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. Now, instead of them, that's the little g gods, he will honor the official religious leaders of Israel. He is not going to honor them. He's going to honor a God of fortresses. Well, who's the God of fortresses? That's the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had fortresses all over. They had them in Israel, in Antonia, Macarius, Caesarea, Sebaste, all over the place. Masada. And they also had them all up on the Euphrates River trying to guard, to maintain the Mesopotamian Valley against the Persians. And so that's how the Romans kept power. All right? How did he honor them? Well, he was constantly giving money. He showered the Romans with gifts to gain his political objectives. He was constantly honoring the Roman Empire. He built so many fortified cities, and it's interesting when he built those cities, what did he do? He named them for Romans. For example, Caesarea, which is still there. You should go there if you have a chance to go to Israel. It's a beautiful little port city there that's preserved as it was back in ancient times, named after Caesar, Julius Caesar, or Augustus Caesar, one of the Caesars. Sebaste, that name is equivalent to Augustus, like Augustus Caesar. Sebaste is what Samaria used to be, the Jewish name. And so forth. And Antonia, the fortress in the temple, named after Mark Antony. So he honored those gods. He honored the god of the fortresses of the Roman Empire by naming the fortresses after emperors of the Roman Empire. Herod was the patron of the Roman Empire from the beginning of his reign all the way to the end. And it was by these fortifications that the Romans extended their power. So Herod honors the God of fortresses, a God unknown to his fathers, the Jewish fathers. Of course, these pagan gods were unknown to them because they were Jews. He honored them with gold and silver because he, as I said, gave the Romans all kinds of political tributes, money, to butter them up. This was a common practice, by the way. Kings did this all the time to try to get their political objectives. Sort of like, it was a gift, it was sort of like a bribe, really. It's happened all the time. So this fits Herod quite nicely, in my humble opinion. Then we go to verse 9. I'm going to use Green's literal translation for this. The translation matters in verse 39. The scripture says this, and he, talking about Herod, he shall act in the strongholds of his fortresses. Now I've emphasized the word in there. He shall act in the strongholds of the fortresses with a foreign god, whom he shall acknowledge. He shall multiply in glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for a price. Now, this is extremely obscure. When you read it, you think, what in the world is this talking about? Well, I'm going to give you another translation. This is the King James. Same, the first part of the verse there. It says, thus he shall do in the most strongholds with a strange God. Again, I underline the preposition in. Now, most translations don't do it like Green's literal translation or the King James Version. Most translations have Herod, or have the person that's referred to in this passage. They don't say it's Herod. They have this person acting against his enemies. For example, in the NIV in Daniel 11:39, we have this. He will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of a foreign god. Well, Herod never did that. And so the translation might be throwing people off who are trying to figure out who this guy is that Daniel's referring to. But now Green's and the KJV, they have Herod putting idols in his own fortresses. He shall act in the stronghold of the fortresses with a foreign god. Well, as a matter of fact, that's exactly what Herod did. He put statues of Caesar in his fortresses all over Israel. And the most famous pagan thing he did is he put a golden eagle, which is the symbol of the Roman Empire. He put a golden eagle in the gate of the temple. And this is an interesting story that Josephus tells us. The pious Jews in the area in Jerusalem got upset by this, took the eagle down and tried to destroy it, and Herod burnt them alive because he was the Roman Empire's boy. He sucked up to the Romans. He did not want any pious Judaism to spring out in his kingdom, to erupt in his kingdom, because it would cost him his political power. So he put in the stronghold of the Romans in the temple where the fortress was, Antonia, the Roman fortress was, in there he put a golden eagle. This fits Herod pretty doggone good, again, in my humble opinion. I'll report, you decide if that fits Antiochus Epiphanes. Well, I don't know where this refers to Antiochus Epiphanes. I can't figure that out. Now, again, using Green's lateral translation on verse 39, it says this, I'm going to take that to mean Herod, he shall multiply in glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for a price. Let's start with multiply in glory. The NIV translates that, he will greatly honor those who acknowledge him. That's a straightforward translation. Multiply in glory is very literal. Greatly honor those who acknowledge him means that Herod will greatly honor the Romans who acknowledge him as the king of Israel. That's straightforward, not a problem there. I don't know how you fit Antiochus Epiphanes IV with that, but it fits Herod pretty doggone good. And it says, he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for a price. Let's start with shall cause them to rule over many. This probably refers to Herod causing the Romans to rule over many Jews, which of course is what he spent all his whole life doing, exalting the rulership of Rome over the Jewish homeland. Now let's look at the last part of verse 39, and we'll finish this video to be taken up next time. It says, he shall multiply in glory, he shall cause them to rule over many, which we just talked about, and he shall divide the land for a price. Well, what does that mean? Well, this is interesting. He had to divide choice pieces of Palestine to give to Cleopatra. I think, I can't think of the name of the place where he had to give to Cleopatra. I know he had to give some land around Jericho to Cleopatra. Cleopatra loved Palestine, which was, of course, was next to Egypt. She was always lusting after the land up there, and she was Mark Antony's girlfriend. And Antony was Herod's ally. Herod could not say no to Cleopatra. He hated her, she hated him, but there's nothing he could do to stop her, because Antony would kill him. That would be the end of it. So, and he couldn't kill Cleopatra, because if he killed Cleopatra, that's killing Mark Antony's girlfriend, and that's not going to go over too good. Antony could come up there with an army and wipe him out. So let me quote you Josephus, and you can see what Herod did in this situation. He, referring to Mark Antony, also took away a great deal of their country, a great deal of Israel, nay, even the plantation of palm trees at Jericho, and bestowed them upon her, upon Cleopatra. He, referring to Herod also hired of Cleopatra, those places that had been torn away from his kingdom at the yearly rent of 200 talents. So Cleopatra couldn't manage the land, so she said, I'll tell you what, I'll rent it back to you, Herod. Herod pays the rent for it. And look at here, Daniel 11:39, Herod shall divide the land for a price. Divides the land, gives it to Cleopatra, and then he rents it back from her for a price. That fits pretty doggone good. All right, that's all we're going to do for this section of Daniel. Stay tuned next time, and we will start with verse 40.